Anybody else other than me enjoy hearing the words, "you're right"? You just crave that moment when somebody walks up to you and goes, "All right, you're right." And it's just like, and you light up and you go, "Tell me more. Please explain to me how I was right." Because there could have been 50 things that I told you that are right. I just want to know which one you're focusing on right now, so that when the other 49 come along, I can be excited about those as well. We enjoy hearing "you're right," don't we? I think everybody, I think it's a pretty universal thing that we all enjoy hearing "you're right." Because we want to believe, we want to know that the things that we've said, the way that we live, who we are, is right. How many of us long to hear those words from God? When we talk about the parables where Jesus says that the master says, "Well done, good and faithful servant, come in." Part of me wonders if in that moment that's God saying, "You're right. You're right with me," is what I mean by that. Not that we're right intellectually with God. Certainly God knows more than we do, right? Not that you're right and that you passed the 100-question quiz, right? You got a perfect score, the quiz to get into heaven, right? It's not about that either. We want to hear "you're right," meaning that God is looking at us and saying, "You're right with me. Welcome home." Thinking about righteousness in that way begins to get us a little bit at what Paul is going to be talking about all through Romans. And the idea of righteousness, as we dive into it, you're going to find it's incredibly complex. And sometimes we've reduced righteousness down to something not just simple, but something that it isn't. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit today, and we'll explore that more as we go for the next 15 weeks. But you're right. Meaning that God, as we stand before God, He looks at us and says, "You are right with me." Not that you've been perfect, not that you've done everything right, not that you intellectually have gotten there and now you suddenly know enough to know and be right before God. But you're right because you're a member of the kingdom of God. That's how Paul's going to define righteousness. So let's dive in. Let's read from Romans chapter 1 first, and then we'll spend some time talking about it. I want to begin in verse 16, and we'll read through the end of the chapter together. Paul says this to the Romans: "For I am not ashamed of this good news about Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Gentile. This good news tells us how God makes us right in His sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by faith. As the Scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. But God shows His anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because He has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshipped and served the things God created instead of the Creator Himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Amen. That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex and instead indulged in sex with each other. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. Men did shameful things with other men, and as a result of this sin, they suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved. Since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, He abandoned them to their foolish thinking, and let them do things that should never be done. Their lives became full of every kind of wickedness, sin, greed, hate, envy, murder, quarreling, deception, malicious behavior, and gossip. They are backstabbers, haters of God, insolent, proud, and boastful. They invent new ways of sinning, and they disobey their parents. They refuse to understand, break their promises, are heartless, and have no mercy. They know God's justice requires those who do these things deserve to die, yet they do them anyway. Worse yet, they encourage others to do them too. So we're ending that reading on a positive note, right? No, Paul's very harsh early on, isn't he? There's good reason, as we're going to talk about it, as we're going to see his argument develop over the next few chapters. He has a reason for speaking this way. As we begin this, I think we have to talk about the Old and New Testament roots of this idea of righteousness or justice. Where does it come from? What's going on? So let's talk about a basic translation and definition of righteousness to begin with here. We'll come to the difficulty of translating it from the Hebrew and Greek in a moment, but the basic understanding of righteousness, here's what I want you to leave with. This is the way that I would look at it. The righteousness is about having right standing or right behavior within the community, within the body of believers. You are in right standing with God. And that comes about not only through right behavior, but through conforming ourselves. And again, not to peek ahead too much, but Paul's going to talk about in Romans 12 about what? Transforming our minds, right? And he says here that they have a confused and dark mind. Did you catch that? So again, Paul's stringing together this interesting argument that he's going to run throughout the book. Right standing or right behavior within the community. The Hebrew word translated righteousness, and I don't want to go too far into a tangent here. I'm a word person. I know some of you are word people as well, but others of you are going, okay, come on, get back to the real stuff. But it's important because the Hebrew word here, and subsequently its Greek cousin, we might say, has a range of meanings in translation. A whole range of meanings. And that's why translators have to make choices whenever they come across the Hebrew word tzedek. That's the word for righteousness or justice, or could be even virtue, and a whole other range of meanings that it can take. And so if you pick up one Bible, one translation, and compare it to another, that's why one translator may have used justice, another one might have used righteous, something like that, or maybe, like I said, even virtue or something else. These words, there's no such thing as a one-to-one correlation. They can have a range of meanings. The same way that in English, if you go to different parts of the country, different people may use the same word, but use it in a very different way. We know this, right? We understand this. It's true in Hebrew and Greek as well. And so sometimes people get bogged down with, well, I just want what the Bible says. Well, which Bible? Which translators are you going to trust to translate it, quote unquote, accurately? Well, they're all doing the best job that they can. But we have to learn to discern what might be going on in that moment. And so the question is, should it be justice or virtue or righteousness or something else? As I said, each of these are appropriate ways to translate. Especially in the Old Testament, we see that one of the primary roles of the king is to mete out tzedek, mete out righteousness or justice. In other words, the king had the specific obligation that the people within his realm knew the true meaning of justice. Now, where was the Israelite king supposed to get that understanding of justice? Well, from the Lord, of course, right? But they have that specific task of meting out justice. In the Old Testament, two areas of thought I think kind of help round out a complete understanding for us. One of those would be the idea of a law court setting. And we see this in the Old Testament a bunch. You go look at the prophets. Go read Job. the way that Job talks to and about God. He talks about desiring for an advocate to come and plead on his behalf that something unjust is happening right now. We see law court language all over in the Old Testament. That idea of righteousness or justice would absolutely come to play in something like this. And that term tzedek, that Hebrew word, comes up a lot in that metaphor. There's another one, though, that I think cuts even deeper and gives us a fuller picture. And it's not opposed to the law court setting. To me, it enhances it. And that is the true metaphor between God and Israel is not one of a law court, but one of a covenant in marriage. We see this all throughout in the prophets. All throughout the prophets, they talk about God and Israel as his wife. And so being righteous, being made right with God in the Old Testament, is to maintain the marriage covenant with God. To be in that covenant and to not break the marriage covenant. That's what being right with God means. And so we see that these two things kind of work together to bring a good picture. And to me, it's with that backdrop, the backdrop of those two ideas, those two metaphors, those two images, that both Jesus and Paul spoke and wrote what they did. And so we see in Matthew, as we just went through Matthew, you probably saw these things. We see several places where Jesus speaks as though the covenantal obligation is now to the way that he is interpreting the law. You probably remember in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, I didn't come to destroy the law, right? No, not even the least stroke of the pen should be taken away from the law. But what does he do? He sums up the law in a new way. And then he says at the end, in chapter 7 of Matthew, the one who listens to my words and then obeys them is my disciple. In other words, is then somebody who is in right standing with God. See, Jesus is shifting the covenantal obligation from law to now the way that he lived his life and wanted us to live. And so we see that through Matthew, and it comes to play in Paul as well. As Paul, like Matthew, also views the idea of righteousness as a shorthand way for talking about God's saving plan for the world. And that, again, is going to come to more fulfillment in Romans as we go through it. So let's talk about Paul's understanding of righteousness. This is sort of going to be like me giving away the end of a book here at the very beginning. And I think that's okay because the journey can still be good. But Paul lays it out himself here at the very beginning. The truth is, we already know how the story ends, right? God wins. So a lot of people want to talk about Revelation, and I still get questions from some of you, like, can we talk about Revelation? And my answer is always going to be no. But that's partly because the end's already written, and I don't need to deal with Revelation myself because it's so weird. We know the end, right? We know the end. God wins. But we're still on the journey. There's this tension in the New Testament, especially the idea of God is already in control, like God has already won. Salvation is here, but it's not fully here. There's a right now and a not yet aspect to the New Testament. And Paul brings that out here as well, as he talks about righteousness. The joy is living our part of this world while we're here. And it's the same for understanding righteousness in Paul, particularly in Romans. So there's no real secret to it. For Paul, the righteousness of God, which is in doubt according to the Jews at the time that he's writing this. A lot of the Jews had given up that God actually cared about them any longer, which is one of the reasons why Jesus' coming at the time that he did was so poignant and so important. They had been returned from exile for hundreds of years, but they still weren't sure that God actually cared about them any longer. So Jesus shows up and he proves God still cares. Your God is still with you and for you. And Paul picks up on that same thing as well. So the righteousness of God has finally and decisively been answered in a new and marvelous way. That's how Paul talks about it. The way that he talks about that is through the life, death, and the resurrection of Jesus. That's how righteousness, that's how God's justice is done in the world, by sending his Son to it. And so because God has decisively acted, God himself is in the right, which was contrary to some belief at that time. The question, had God given up on the promise to Abraham, was prevalent in Paul's day. What is Paul's answer? Absolutely not. That promise is not done yet. Had God given up on the promise to David? Paul's answer, absolutely not. Had God given up on his promise to the prophets? Paul's answer is absolutely not. And so the gospel message, the good news that Paul is so proud to proclaim, declares that God is in the right, that God himself is righteous, that God himself is just. And we know this, as Paul says, because God has kept his covenant, God has decisively dealt with sin, and that God has not shown favoritism, rather. We talked about that last week with Peter, right? He shows up to Cornelius' house and says God has not shown favoritism. God has not shown favoritism in his decisive righteous act of forgiveness. So these are the different themes that are going to get played out through the remainder of Romans, and hopefully I'm going to try to weave them together and to view this tapestry that Paul puts together in Romans. It's really beautiful to behold. So there's a final introductory note here, rather, that I want to pay attention to at this moment, as I think it informs the rest of the conversation about righteousness that we're going to have. And that is that a popular way to think about righteousness, especially in evangelical churches, is that God imparts or distributes righteousness to individual people. In other words, that God looks down at people and he says, I'm going to give righteousness to that person, but I don't think I'm going to give righteousness to that person. And then I like that person, so I'm going to give righteousness to that person, but this one, no, not so much. And you probably have heard this talked about as predestination, right? That's where all these things for a lot of these evangelical churches kind of go together. It probably won't surprise you that I'm going to say I think that's wrong. I don't think there's much, if any, scriptural basis to imagine a God who looks down at God, at his people, this creation that he loves, that he called good, and he looks at us as individuals and goes, righteousness for you, but not for you. Solely on the basis of that's what he decided. I don't think Scripture teaches us that. And they seem to claim that. Paul talks about that, but as we go through Romans, I hope I can help make it clear to you that I don't think that's at all the way that Paul talks about righteousness. Really not even one little bit. Righteousness isn't something that God distributes to the person who either does or doesn't do his will. Righteousness is the condition a person has because they are part of the covenant people of God. If you are part of God's family, if you are part of the kingdom of God, you are righteous. And it's not because God has implanted that on you. It's not because God has distributed that to you especially. It's because that's the outcome of being part of God's kingdom. And so a person is in right standing with God, not because God chose for that person to have right standing and then just, doled it out to them. A person is in right standing because they have become part of the covenant people of God. I think this is the proper way to understand righteousness. Precisely because of the debate we see that Paul has with the Jewish Christians in Rome and in other places in Galatians. You probably notice that they want to maintain that a person is made right because they do certain things, right? They need to be circumcised, they need to keep kosher laws, they need to keep the law of God, the Old Testament law. Paul comes along and says that those who are inheritors of the covenant membership, he talks about it in Galatians as those who are the true children of Abraham, have no need to keep the law any longer. They are made righteous because they are part of the kingdom. So, let's talk specifically. That's kind of an overview. Let's quickly run through what he says in Romans chapter 1 about righteousness. First, I want to start with his little bit about the gospel here. Now, Paul makes an interesting statement that he is not ashamed of the gospel. And that led me to ask, well, why should he be ashamed of the gospel? What's there to be ashamed of, right? He declares that the gospel is power for salvation. But what is the gospel? Well, the Greek word simply means good news. It wasn't a distinctly Christian word. This is a word that Christians began to use distinctly about themselves, but anybody in the Greek-speaking world used the word good news all over the place. It was good news to announce that the emperor was arriving to your city. So heralds would go forth and pronounce the good news that the emperor, Caesar, is coming to our town. So what's interesting is that when Christians begin to use this word good news about Jesus, it becomes an anti-empire rhetoric. Just as proclaiming Jesus as Lord became anti-empire rhetoric. And so what does Paul have to be ashamed of? Well, we would say nothing, really. But he certainly maybe has something to fear from a human standpoint. As we know, not long after Paul wrote this and lived his life, Christians came under heavy persecution to the point that many of them were killed. Because the religious groups in Rome were not happy that people were turning away from worshiping their gods. They weren't happy with the fact that people were calling somebody else Lord other than Caesar, other than the emperor. You just didn't do that. But the Christians did. And so Paul is encouraging them, continue to take up that truth. Speak that anywhere that you go. But that then leads us into a question, why would we be ashamed of the gospel? I mean, certainly none of us, I would guess, truly fear for our lives in terms of persecution for our beliefs, right? I don't. I mean, if I were to walk, I could walk downtown with a bullhorn and say, I'm a Christian all day long, and most likely nobody's going to come up and kill me. They're not going to throw me in jail for doing that, right? But what do we face? What kind of shame or persecution do we face? Well, certainly there's a lot, right? Especially in our day where, it's no surprise that in media and other places, Christians aren't well loved right now, right? And so a lot of Christians begin to hide and are ashamed of their faith because they don't want to be called old-fashioned, right? Look at that person and their old-fashioned beliefs. What are they thinking? Can't they get with the times already? Right? We don't want to be known as goody two-shoes or whatever, the other labels we can think of. So there are a lot of Christians. Shame may not be the right word, but we're kind of in hiding at the moment. And I wonder about that. I wonder what that means for us as individuals, but more, I wonder what that means for us as the church. What does it mean that we're in hiding? What does it do to us? What does it do to the church if we go into hiding for fear of being humiliated on Facebook or on Twitter? Or probably not a lot of you are on Twitter, but what does it mean for us, though? Paul declares it's not going to work. He's specifically speaking into their situation and saying it's not going to work to be ashamed of the gospel. The good news is power, not shame, and not fear. And so Paul declares that those who believe this gospel, this power of salvation, are declared in the right by their faith. And this offer is both to the Jew and also to the Gentiles. And it is the gospel that reveals God's righteousness or his justice. And here again, I think we have to lean into the difficulty of translating this word. For a Jew like Paul, both of these ideas, and like I said, even more, they would hold all of those ideas together in this one word. It contains all of those things. And so when we read righteousness in the New Testament or justice in the New Testament, we have to hold both of those ideas in mind at the same time. We have to be careful to do that. So how is God's justice, how is God's righteousness revealed through the gospel? I already stated it before. The gospel is the good news about one man, about Jesus, the true emperor, the true king, God's promised one. He came to begin the process of setting right what is wrong in this world. It sounds like God's justice or righteousness to me, that God is going to be just in the way that he deals with setting right what is wrong in our world. I think we can probably all agree there's a lot wrong in our world. And I don't just mean because of people, or I don't just mean what people do. I'm talking about all over creation, right? And Paul brings that into a larger argument in Romans 8. Again, he establishes some things early on, and then they pay off chapters later. In Romans 8, he talks about all of creation groaning, waiting, hopeful for that renewal one day. Righteousness, justice of God is that Jesus came and offers salvation to all. If God didn't keep his promises, if God refused to set the world right, then God wouldn't be righteous. God wouldn't be just. But God precisely is, Paul says, because his plan has been fulfilled. It's not done, but it's been fulfilled through Jesus. The final thing I want to talk about is to make right what is wrong. The question that frames this whole conversation of righteousness is what needs to be made right, or maybe perhaps who needs to be made right. And this is going to pay off next week as Paul turns it on its head with the Jews and says, okay, you've been laughing all along as I've been writing, thinking I'm only talking about the Gentiles in chapter 1, but really I'm also talking about you. But I don't want to jump too far ahead. That's what's coming next week, though. For Paul lays it out pretty clearly here in chapter 1 about humanity. Anybody ever bought a piece of fruit or a vegetable and it looks good on the outside, and then you cut into it or you bite into it and you go, oh, that is awful. I mean, just rotten. Looks good on the outside, but really it's just an empty shell. I think that's the way Paul is talking about humanity in chapter 1. They look the same. They have the form of a human, right? Like when I look at a person, I see, yep, they're a human being. They have 2 eyes, ears, hair, maybe, all those kind of things. But on the inside, I wasn't specific. I didn't look at you or anything, Randy. I wasn't thinking about any person in particular. I was more talking about the fact that I'm beginning to lose it. You can look at a human being and see they're human. What does Paul say? They're rotten to the core. I think that's what he's talking about here. There's a reason that God's righteousness needed to be revealed in the world. There's a reason that God's justice needs to be done in the world. And it begins with us. It begins with our rottenness. It's not Paul's word, that's mine, but I think that's what he's saying. But this is the very thing the good news is for. We are the very thing the good news is for. And by good news, I mean Jesus. Right? Good news to me equals Jesus. I think that's how Paul talks about good news. If God's justice, if his righteousness revealed in the good news of the gospel isn't for this, then what's it for? So I think you see the beginnings of Paul's arguments here at work that are going to get, like I said, they're going to pay off later on. And Paul further illustrates this rotten core idea when he effectively says that God threw up his hands. That's not the language he uses. What does he say? He says God gave them over. That's mentioned 3 times right here in chapter 1. It's almost like God throws up his hands and says, okay, have it your way for a while. Anybody ever had to do that with your own children? They're just browbeating you to death about something. You go, okay, fine. Have it your way for a while. And what? Learn from your mistakes, right? I think that's how Paul is talking about what God has done for humanity. that we kept fighting against and fighting against and fighting against and fighting against, and finally God says, okay, have it your way for a while. But learn from your mistakes, which is what we all hope for our own children as well. And then, of course, we see the long litany that Paul gives of the various ways that humanity has let God down. If you didn't see yourself in that list, I encourage you to go back and look again. I don't mean that in a rude way. I just mean you're there. I promise you you're there. And you're supposed to be there. You're not supposed to stay there, but Paul intends for you to find yourself there. Paul wrote this letter to the Romans knowing that as they read it, that list would be hard to read. That as they got to it, they would go, oh man, can you just stop, Paul? Please, I don't want to see myself anymore in this list. That's on purpose. You're supposed to find yourself there. You're not supposed to stay there. And that's what Paul's going to go on and talk about in the rest of Romans. Because Paul is spelling out why God's justice, why his righteousness, why that good news, why Jesus is so important to the world. So as we continue to go through Romans, I want you to do one thing for me. Try as best you can to ignore the chapter breaks. I know we're going to go by chapter, but that's more just for convenience sake. As you're reading, maybe one way to do this is next week, if you're going to read chapter 2, don't just read chapter 2. Read 1 and flow into chapter 2 and see how Paul is taking what we call chapter 1 and playing it out in chapter 2, because he didn't write with chapters. He didn't write with chapter headings, with verse numbers. He just wrote. He's crafting this beautiful argument all through Romans. All right. So to conclude for today, just a few takeaways. First, do you believe that the gospel is still good news for the world today? Do you believe the gospel is still good news for the world today? Secondly, are you then proud to represent the gospel? If you believe it's good news for the world today, is it something you're proud to say, that's a part of my life? Or are we trying to hide from that? And then lastly, how do you, or maybe how have you, seen God's justice, God's righteousness being worked out in the world? Have you seen that? Have you taken notice in the last week? Some people ask it this way, where did you see God this week? That's what I'm talking about. Have you seen God's righteousness in the world this week? I hope you're looking for it, because it's there. Sometimes we get good at not seeing God because we get so focused on other things in our lives. Let's look for God this week. That's the good news. Jesus is the good news. Because I don't know about you, but I need good news. I'm in that list that Paul wrote in chapter 1. I'm there. Show of hands, anybody else who's there? Some of you are lying. All right, cool. You can come talk to me this week. We'll talk about. I'll point out to you how you're there. Will that work? I'm not going to do that. This is good news. And I hope this week that as you embrace the gospel, the good news, that it is power in your life, and that you won't be ashamed to say, this is who I am. If you have any need this morning, we're going to have a time to stand and sing, that you have the opportunity to come forward to make those needs known to us. We can surround you, pray for you, help take care of you if we can. So come forward as we stand and sing.